Design Notes is a show about creative work and what it teaches us. I'm your host, Liam Spradlin. Each episode, I speak with people from unique creative fields to discover what inspires and unites us in our practice.
500 years ago, a typeface cost more than a small private army. This was like a royal technology, and it was extremely powerful. The printing press caused revolutions, and maybe the fact of printing existing as a technology itself caused a scientific revolution.
That was Dave Crossland, a designer who wears so many hats in the world of digital type that one can only sum up his role as font expert, or to be official, lead operations manager for Google Fonts. In our conversation, I asked Dave about the social impact of digital type, on our lives, on ideas about how software should be made and distributed, and on the practice of design broadly, speculating on how we as designers, with a little imagination, might unlock new possibilities. Let's get started. Hi, Dave. Welcome to Design Notes.
Hey, how are you?
Good. So to start off, as usual, why don't you introduce yourself and the work that you're doing?
Well, I'm working with the Google Fonts team as the sort of operations manager. So often, I kind of get boiled down to like the team font expert. And I've been on the team for over 10 years. So I sort of, know everything that's going on, a lot of context. And so I'm often explaining, what we do can be very nuanced. There's a lot of depth to typography, but at the same time, it's something which a lot of people don't think about too much. And so a lot of my work is sort of explaining type designers, to Google, and Google the type designers as we commission fonts.
Tell me a little bit about how you got there. What is the journey like to become font expert?
I think, I've always, since I was, sort of an early teenager, been interested in graphic design and, publishing, the sort of power of information and information design. And that's what I went to study at college in the UK. I'm English, and I went to Ravensbourne College of Design, initially in a graphic design program, and I graduated in interaction design. And then a couple of years after that, I attended the University of Reading, which has an old kind of red brick, kind of Ivy League style university, has a department of typography, and within that, a master's program in typeface design. And so I attended that for a couple of years. And as I was a student, the sort of web font revolution was happening, and this ability to use any font on a web page was sort of re-arriving. It was something that had been in there in the 90s, but had kind of gone away, and then came back, some 12 years ago. And so I was very keen on the idea of, what I call Libra fonts. Other people may call open source fonts. And, that was sort of a bit of a radical idea back then. Recently, I was chatting with a recent graduate, and I said, well, before Google Fonts, and they were like, no, I was like, 12 when it came out. They remember
before.
They remember that, yeah.
Why was that a radical idea?
I think if you go back about 10 years, there was just very, very few fonts which were available under such sort of permissive license terms, where anyone can use it for any purpose and even modify the font itself. And, a big question will be, wow, it's a huge effort to design a typeface, to draw everything. And it's difficult to do that on a hobbyist kind of part-time basis. If you try and do type design as a hobby, you just may not be able to put enough concentrated time into it to get good at it. And so people who really get into it are really investing, years of that life into it. And so to design a typeface for 6 months, that's as a full-time effort, that's something that's got to be paid. Mm-hmm. And so, always with sort of Libra licensing of things, then people can sometimes feel a bit mystified about why would anyone be paid to do something that's given away. There are organizations that benefit from work being freely available. It's more valuable to that organization for the work to be unrestricted. And that's really the case here with Google Fonts. Having fonts which are not, tied into Google's products, that are totally open and can float around with their text. The document can be exported and imported in and out of any application. That's important for people, and especially, as we keep advancing into the future with new mediums, there's kind of AR, VR stuff, right now. Seems to be, a sort of new platform, new technology that people are exploring. And so the ability to, to always be able to move forwards, even if a company from a previous era ends up going out of business, going out of the way, if they've been publishing free and open Libra software or, fonts or other things, those things can have a future life. So yeah, it was a new thing back then, and was seen as a bit radical because people I think had some anxiety back then about how it was going to work.
You also mentioned the aspects of type design that are really integral to the process, but that people maybe don't think about very much. Could you talk a little bit about some of those?
To me, something that's been driving me to work on this for over a decade is there's this sort of amazing tension between the ubiquity of type and its obscurity. You can't go anywhere in the world, in any urban environment, without being surrounded by text. And yet, the fact that someone has drawn those letters that you're seeing, and that there's this system of shapes going on, is something that's totally below the level of consciousness. I think one of the the biggest trends in these years that I've been working on this has been this continued globalization and internationalization of type. Hundreds of years ago, there was a lot of ads in London, Paris, New York, but that wasn't the case in a lot of other nations' capitals. And today smartphones are becoming something that everyone has, and digital typography, digital advertising is becoming a real big business. I think today you go to India and you'll see commercial billboards on the side of the highway that are in English, but it's also the world's largest democracy, so a lot of the political billboards are in the local languages, the local writing systems. And so, I think, there have been these commercial drivers in the past, but I think that with digital typography, digital advertising, we're seeing that change.
I think it's interesting to point out how much type kind of constructs the world around us, or how much it's surrounding us in urban areas. And the fact that someone made that. Something that I like to explore a lot on Design Notes is how we as designers are placing ourselves in the world. And it strikes me that this is kind of a special placement, as it were, because we are placing ourselves in the type that is then being placed by other people into other contexts. I guess I'm interested in your thoughts on what that relationship is and how we can be conscious of it as designers.
Well, I would say that, really the real value of different type is the emotional note that it adds to the text. And so, this is in a way kind of true subliminal advertising. There's not really secret messages in a single frame of an advert on TV or whatever. They're all kind of 1950s ideas, right? The kind of weird shapes in the ice cubes kind of stuff. It's not, as far as I know, that's not real. But the way that letter forms, shapes make you feel, that is real. And there's, a lot of fonts for the Latin writing system, that we use in English and other European languages. But there's very few for many of the world's writing systems. And, you go, and you see like an ice cream shop, I think it's Baskin Robbins in the States. It's like a big, international chain. And, when you travel around the world, you're going to see Baskin Robbins shops, and they're going to have, Baskin Robbins written in another writing system, and it's not going to match. The way the two the typefaces look is not going to match, not going to carry the same feeling. So I think there's a huge amount of potential for the future in developing a much richer palette of type options for all the world's cultures.
Speaking a little bit about the impact that type can have on our emotions, our socialization, kind of impact that it can have on the world. I'm curious if there are specific projects at Google Fonts that you think have had a particular role in that area that you would want to talk about.
Sure. I mean, going back the old days when Google Fonts launched, we had a kind of breakout hit in the lobster font. And,
Oh, yeah.
these days, pretty much every city, you'll see lobster around. That was sort of important in the early days because when you saw lobster on the web, you knew that wasn't a system font. That was something that you hadn't seen before. Since those early days, the Google Fonts team has grown to invest in 4 areas. We're working on Google's company branding type. We work on the operating system type for Android and Chrome OS and other operating systems. And then we have, Lobster and all this other expressive options for products. And then we also invest in, sort of the foundational technology. So things like, font quality checking tools, or even the font formats itself. I would say that, the idea of the Unicode standard itself, the idea of bringing all the world's writing systems, together into one standard and making that completely, interoperable and universal is sort of, again, part of that real foundation that, Google Fonts is building on. And so, codifying languages as digital fonts, is something I think which is really important. Literacy, accessibility, these are sort of foundational human needs, the type is a really key building block of that stuff.
Speaking of factors that people might not consider related to type design, as you know, it strikes me, especially as you're talking, that to be a type designer also involves like a significant amount of technical skill as well, right? That the type design kind of becomes a different mode of creative practice or of production.
Yeah. I mean, I think, again, for me to be, obsessively working on this for 10 years has meant, there's the visual culture aspect, the linguistic aspect, the technology, the business, and all of these things are interrelated.
In a lot of recent reading I've been doing about concepts surrounding digital production and how that influences kind of social systems that inform our lives, I've read about how free software that we talked about earlier has sought to kind of like reconfigure or re-socialize the relationship that we have to practices like this, to making digital products and the processes behind production. Having mentioned that being a type designer already involves kind of a different mode of production from a lot of other design disciplines, I guess I would ask more broadly how Google Fonts fits into that, kind of affecting the relationship that we have perhaps to digital products.
Yeah, I think, there's an old idea about, value having 2 sides. There's the direct usefulness of a thing, sort of use value, and then it's, value in exchange, what can you sell it for? And, when you produce things where they're having to be directly monetized and you're producing for exchange, then that can sometimes, create incentives that kind of warp the thing. And, designers can end up, maybe being told by the business to go and optimize that side of the value proposition, to the detriment of the usefulness. And an example of this outside of type and, maybe outside of design would be like healthy food. Healthy food could be cheap. It doesn't have to be the top tier deluxe stuff, but it's more profitable to sell food which is addictive and unhealthy, and we end up with food deserts in the urban landscape. And so, with fonts, to some extent, this can also be the case. Language support can be missing for certain nations which don't present a large buy side of the marketplace. And with Google Fonts, what we've heard is that there's an issue where some type designers that we've commissioned have seen the incentives such that they don't put their best effort into their project because it's a fixed fee, it's being paid up front, and there's not the same speculative retail or revenue opportunity that they have with their own projects. And they will put their best effort into a project, which they're making to retail. But what they'll earn with that over, say, 5 or 10 years is speculative. It could be close to zero. It could be, millions of dollars. So over the years, right? So, personally, I wouldn't see that. I think that's unwise because the Libra fonts become the most widely used ones, and that becomes what type designers' reputations get staked on. But other people see that differently. So I think, when making free software or making Libra fonts, often people are making them for themselves, and maybe they're being commissioned and their time is being paid for, but that exchange value aspect is being sort of taken out of the equation, and the focus can be on making it as useful as possible.
Do you see that as a model that could work for other things, especially in digital production?
Well, I think those other things came first. That was definitely my idea. That when I went to do a master's degree in type design, I was very focused on this idea of sort of bringing some of these ideas from the Libra software movement, Wikipedia, Creative Commons. These things were, there was much more of a buzz around them. Creative Commons was new, when I was a student. We do see, people making Libra fonts typically under the open font license outside of what Google Fonts is doing. And so different governments, different individual designers, different companies have decided to go with making their fonts freely available, nothing to do with Google.
Yeah, I was going to ask, do you think that kind of the success of Google Fonts or the ubiquity of those fonts, because they are free, has had an effect on the industry? But it seems like maybe those things are happening in multiple places independently at once.
Yeah, I mean, obviously Google Fonts is in certain respects is big, in other respects is small. So I think there's probably more open Libra fonts today, if with Google Fonts existing, than there would be without Google Fonts existing. But that's hard to say. It's sort of a speculative fiction there. And in my studies, in being a student of type design, the history of all this is something that's emphasized. And I think when you go into the different eras of the type industry in the past, there's always been a $0 tier. Before digital, those physical typesetting machines would come bundled with a few choices, that are sort of free. And before Google Fonts, there was plenty of freeware fonts around on Dafont and other places. And in the 90s, if you got a Corel Draw, it came with a CD with hundreds of fonts on it. If you had to get them individually, it'd be way more than Corel Draw. So there's always been a sort of cheaper option. So I think if Google Fonts didn't exist, there would be less people enjoying using type to express themselves and identify their brands on the web, themselves on the web, and the type industry overall would be smaller. There'd just be less people using different type and thinking about type. So I know some people see it differently, and they could count every use of a Libra font as a lost sale. But that's sort of like when people say, "Oh, the Pirate Bay costs the movie industry more than the GDP of Japan," or whatever. Like in the real world, that kind of simplistic economic ideology, just doesn't work like that. And I think what really happens is often the opposite of what simple theories predict. So I would say, that it's good for everyone in the type business that more and more people around the world are choosing and using different fonts, thanks to Google Fonts making it so easy. And I'm English. We have the BBC in England, in the UK, which sets a very high bar for the quality of TV. And then there is private cable style TV. Satellite TV that's even better because it has to compete with that public option, and people don't just watch the BBC or just watch private TV. They're going to see the good TV programming that's entertaining or whatever. The highest traffic websites using Google Fonts do not purely use Google Fonts. They're using type from a mix of sources because it's ultimately about the typefaces and the typography. And the licensing terms, the cost is a factor, but it's something of a secondary factor. So I would see, Libra software, Libra culture, Libra fonts is like this kind of global public service provision that's setting a baseline which means no one's excluded below that baseline, and sets the stage for more broad competition in the marketplace. And the fourth area of our investment in a tooling technology, that is something that is directly improving the overall business and industry. We have excellent QA tools and know-how about how to finalize and productionize typeface designs, which is available to everyone in the world who wants to enter the business. And so there's a more level playing field.
When you talk about, the perception that maybe a use of a free font is a lost sale, or things about movie piracy without going too deep into it, that maybe some of those thoughts are coming from a friction between modes of understanding what a product is and how it's distributed, between historical analog implementations versus digital ones. And I'm curious what you think about that, because as I learned about type design, it seemed like type had this kind of friction for a long time of like, how is type distributed? How has it been distributed historically? How does that line up? Like, how have we tried to replicate that in a digital space? And where has that gone right or wrong?
In the past, these previous eras of type, when type was physical, especially, at the end of the pre-digital period where we had the sort of dry transfer lettering, like Letraset was one of the, the inventors, like the leading brand of this. You literally like rubbed out the letters one by one on the dry paper, and you paid by the letter, and that kind of business model where you had to buy the type,
Wow.
by the letter is not coming back. And even before that, like metal type would wear out and need to be recast and rebought. So I think that was the case, as I said, in London, New York, Paris, but in most of the rest of the world, there just there wasn't that much typography going on. And today there's this huge growth in demand for type globally. So the distribution models and so on, the idea of buying a font on a floppy disk, well, that was working, sort of working for English, I remember. And I was a student, that was just kind of on the way out, right? And OpenType, where you could have more than 250 glyphs in a font file, was sort of coming in. But I sort of got a glimpse into those older days where even for English, digital type was kind of tricky, and so yeah, I think as the technology improves, it's just a better experience for people making publications in a broader sense, and that's going to lead to more people wanting to make good quality stuff and wanting to use good quality type, new type. There's a fashion aspect to it. I mean, type has such a long history. It predates capitalism almost. So 500 years ago, a typeface cost more than a small private army. This was like a royal technology, and it was extremely powerful, right? That the printing press caused revolutions, and maybe sort of Marshall McLuhan idea, but maybe the fact of printing existing as a technology itself caused a scientific revolution. That way of thinking about atomizing and breaking things down into their pieces and making them uniform and repeatable and reproducible. The type was like the first mass-produced product, and so that power has not gone away, but it's only got cheaper and cheaper over time, over hundreds of years. But yeah, we still have a good business, a good industry, healthy industry that lots of people around the world are making type today. So I don't know. I'm not sure if that really addresses, your question. And it's something that, personally, I've been in a privileged position where I've been working with Google pretty much since I graduated, and Google's been cutting the checks to develop all the type that's almost all the type that's in Google fonts.
Yeah, I think it does address the question, as digital type as a whole is like such a surface for exploring like how things move from analog to digital modes of production and distribution. Type continues to evolve into a place, speaking as someone who works on a design system during the day, like I'm very interested in the capacity for variable type to embody a system that can satisfy user intent without knowing about it, and perhaps like requires a designer intent that is more facilitating of a wider range of expression.
Mm-hmm.
I want to just like jump into that a little bit and talk about it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the way that I've been sort of advocating for variable fonts, variable typography, flexible typography, is to say that there's three main benefits to variable fonts: to compress, to express, and to finesse. And what you touched on there was the third thing, where we can improve the user experience in a way where they're not even especially conscious of it. It's this is kind of automatic finessing that's individual and providing subtle accessibility improvements, which maybe at a mass scale could be measured, but it can be quite subtle. And so to break down those three things, the to compress benefit is that if you take a set of static fonts and you look at the total file size there, if you were going to use all of those styles within those families, and then you look at the file size of those families as variable fonts, then often you see a pretty big reduction in file size. Now, obviously, if you're just using Lobster, it's a single style font, there's no reduction possible with variable fonts. If you're just using regular and bold, there's probably also not really a reduction. But even if you are just using regular and bold as a variable font, you now have all of the weights from regular to bold. And so maybe those semi-bold, medium weights can be useful for you. And as designers, we can do large type or even text type, and choose type for its expressivity, for those feelings that it evokes. And being able to kind of dial in and fine tune those feelings, that expressiveness is exciting. But that automatic style selection, I think, is really the most powerful benefit here. And so, the big example of this is this idea of optical size designs, where in pre-digital, phototype, every piece of metal type was being made at a physical size. And so the marginal cost of customizing the typeface design to that size was very small. And then when we had phototype, you took one design and you just scaled it up and down to the size you wanted, and you lost that size specific design. And so today with variable fonts, we can have a sort of continuous range of designs from a very small design to a very large design, and then multiply that across weights and widths. So the heaviest weight, the lightest weight can be much more extreme at a large size. And then as the size comes down, the type kind of gets more resilient, and the readability and legibility is reinforced or sort of defended, and the actual proportions get less extreme, even though it's still like the maximum possible at that size.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the designers, end users, font users, have not really even begun to scratch the surface of what variable fonts can mean for typography. And there's this old Marshall McLuhan idea that when a new technology or a sort of new paradigm arrives, what he called a medium, as opposed to the message that it carries, when that medium arrives in society, then initially it's only used to mimic and emulate the previous technology that was most similar to it. So, for example, early radio hosts, they would dress up in like a full-on, three-piece suit to announce the news on the radio, as if they were doing a public speaking event in front of a large live audience, even though they were, stuck in a studio. Early cinema, they would stick a camera in the middle of a theater auditorium and film a stage play. And only later did you get, radio shows that were not mimicking giving a speech, and, films like, say, Orson Welles' and Kane, that pioneered new ideas about how to create cinema that was cinematographic. So what we see with variable fonts is that they're being understood today with that kind of compressed benefit. We could say misunderstood, that it's all about the smaller file size version of static fonts. And especially for, technology companies, engineering managers, can really get that, because that's a very measurable benefit. You had what you had before and the file size is smaller. and there's no change to the design, there's no change to the typography. It's just a pure engineering benefit that can be very easily quantified. But I think that kind of overlooks the real, value and opportunity. And what's going to happen is that the designers using variable fonts are going to become sort of pioneers and discover the deeper nature of the new medium of typography, of fluid or variable typography. And they're going to come up with new kinds of designs that weren't possible with static fonts. There's this sort of meeting place between the type designer and the type user. And variable fonts kind of start to break down that barrier that in the past with static fonts, the type designer issues, the final release of the project, like this is it. And then the type users work with what they have. And with variable fonts, there's this sort of, type design on rails kind of thing, where you have so many options as the font user, you can fine tune so many key aspects of the typeface, yet you're not drawing the shapes. So you're still within, predetermined ranges of what you can choose from. But you get this incredibly fine-grained control. And it becomes kind of like a musical instrument. Obviously, you have the possibility to make horrendous sounds, but also you can make something which, really sings and that no one's ever heard before.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating, the idea of bringing who we consider users closer to the process of design or production. But also, I think this must have tremendous implications for design as a practice as well, because we're no longer focused on designing single points in a design space, but now we can do line segments or planes or entire three-dimensional shapes as designers. What does that do to the mental model of a design practitioner for what they're creating?
Yeah, I think it's there's a lot of potential which is yet to be explored, and I think that this potential is in the total systems, and it can be difficult to kind of get into it when you're dealing with kind of snapshots of static frames in a design app where you're sort of ideating and mocking things up. And that the how things work sort of within the actual medium of the digital experience is where it's going to be.
I also remember being struck, like learning about the concept of design space in variable type, that it is in fact multidimensional to an extent that is hard to even visualize as humans living in the three-dimensional perceptive space that we do.
Yeah. I mean, we're offering variable fonts like Roboto Flex, which have got over a dozen axes. And there is a real system behind that. It isn't, a dozen completely different things. There's a dozen things that are interrelated and that work as a system. And definitely visualizing, more than 3 dimensions can get even 3 dimensions can get kind of trippy. What do
you think lies in the future for that? How do you think that process changes to become more apprehendable, or does it?
I've always been, in that sort of, that kind of old chestnut about like, should designers code? I've been very much, coming into design from a technology culture, and so I think that in the same way, there's been some work around how to better visualize programs, because they also can end up as these very complex kind of multi-dimensional abstract entities, it's I think a lot of people, myself included, who go into design, they have such strong math skills. There's 3 kind of people in this world: those you can count and those you can't. And so that's definitely me, right? And so I think that there is some kind of more direct experience of this stuff, which can be hard to translate or visualize.
I think it's very important to call out the importance of approaching this from a technical aspect as well, because the things that we create as designers are also mediated by things that were designed themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps you must create the thing that allows you to design in order to design the thing that you truly want to make.
Right. Yeah. And in my teaching practice, a huge, one of my like primary principles of teaching is to walk students through an experience first of making. and then give them some theory to deconstruct their experience. And well, it sounds silly, but to structure it then, right? That when you have the direct kind of raw experience and you don't really know the theories behind what you're doing, then you have your senses are more open to the total thing. And like in stage magic, there's this sort of the way that illusions work is the misdirection, right? That humans are very good at deleting out stuff that they perceive from their awareness. And so having people go first in experiencing something means that they're not filtering their experience based on a kind of ideological prejudice. And so, yeah, I would say that's pretty deep to design practice, and that it's important to try and experience the medium directly and work with the medium through its own logic, rather than trying to treat it like a version of the old medium, the old way of doing things. Like I said, I really credit Marshall McLuhan with a lot of this stuff. I know that's like a kind of design school classic, but it definitely shaped my thinking about all this stuff.
That's great. I think that's a great note to reflect on as we close. Thank you again for joining me today, Dave.
All right. I think I've got to go change someone's diaper.
You can subscribe to Design Notes on Google Podcasts, iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your podcasts, so you never miss an episode. In the meantime, follow Design Notes Pod on Twitter and let me know your thoughts. I'd love to hear your feedback, suggestions, and guest recommendations as we get started in Season 2. Also, leave us a rating on iTunes or Spotify if you're liking the show. Until next time, thanks for listening.